It was just an ordinary afternoon when Malik, a 16-year-old high school student, walked down the street after school. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow on the quiet neighborhood. He had his backpack slung over his shoulder, earbuds in, minding his own business. It was a short walk home, just a few blocks away. Malik wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just looking forward to getting home and finishing his homework. But as he walked, he noticed something strange. A man was standing by his car, watching him. Malik didn't know who he was, but the man's gaze felt sharp, almost like he was being judged. The man stood there for a moment, watching Malik carefully. Malik didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the man was just waiting for someone. Then, the man started walking towards him. Malik couldn't tell what the man wanted, but he was nervous. As the man got closer, he suddenly spoke. "You! Stop right there," the man said, his voice harsh and demanding. Malik froze. "What's going on?" he asked, his heart starting to race. The man, whom Malik soon realized was a lawyer named Mr. Johnson, pointed a finger at him. "You're the one who stole my phone. I saw you trying to grab it out of my hand." The accusation hit Malik like a punch to the stomach. "Wait, I didn't steal anything." Malik tried to explain, but Mr. Johnson wasn't listening. Mr. Johnson was quick to dial the police. His hands shook slightly as he explained the situation, his voice steady but filled with certainty. "I've just been attacked by a thief. This young man tried to snatch my phone right out of my hands," he said. His words were sharp, convincing. He was a lawyer after all, and his tone held a weight that Malik couldn't match. Malik stood there, confused and desperate to explain, but the lawyer continued to speak. "He was following me for several blocks. I felt like I was being watched. I was nervous, so I kept my phone in my hand, but then, just like that, he lunged for it." Malik's eyes widened. That wasn't true. He hadn't been following anyone. He hadn't even seen Mr. Johnson before today. But the more the lawyer spoke, the more convinced the police seemed to be. The officer on the phone didn't question Mr. Johnson's story, nor did they seem interested in hearing Malik's side. Malik tried to interrupt, but the lawyer kept talking, his voice louder now. "I tried to back away, but he became aggressive. He shoved me and made a grab for my phone. I managed to keep it, but it was clear that he meant trouble." The police officer on the other end of the line asked Mr. Johnson a few more questions, then assured him help was on the way. The call ended, and the officer looked at Malik. "Stay here," they said, as if the matter was already settled. Malik couldn't believe it. His heart was pounding in his chest. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the lawyer's words had already made it seem like he was guilty. Malik stood there, his heart racing, trying to hold himself together. The police had arrived, but they weren't looking at him the way he expected. They were focused on Mr. Johnson, listening to every word he said, nodding as though they already believed the story. "I wasn't following anyone," Malik finally said, his voice shaking. "I was just walking home. I don't know that man." He pointed to the lawyer, who was standing a few feet away, watching him with cold eyes. The officer turned to Malik, but their expression was blank, uninterested. "Stay calm," the officer said. "We'll need to take your statement." "I didn't do anything wrong," Malik repeated, but it felt like his words were getting lost in the air. He tried to explain again, but the officer wasn't looking at him the same way they were looking at Mr. Johnson. The lawyer had a suit, a confident attitude, and a clear story. Malik had none of that. He was just a teenager, dressed in his school uniform, and he felt small under their gaze. The officer asked him questions, but they didn't feel right. "Where are you coming from?" they asked. "Why were you in this area?" Malik felt like he was being interrogated, as if his presence there was somehow suspicious. He had just walked from his school, the same path he took every day. "I'm just a student," Malik said, feeling frustrated. "I'm just walking home." He felt like the more he explained, the less anyone seemed to believe him. He looked around, but no one else was speaking up. No one else was coming to his defense. He felt more alone than ever, but deep down, he knew the truth. He hadn't stolen anything. He didn't even know what the lawyer was talking about. Across the street, Mrs. Harris, an older woman walking her dog, had been watching the scene unfold. She had noticed the commotion and, out of curiosity, had stopped to see what was going on. When she saw Mr. Johnson pointing at Malik, shouting, and then calling the police, Something didn't sit right with her. The teenager didn't look like someone who had just stolen a phone. She saw him standing still, looking confused and scared, not at all like someone trying to escape with something he didn't own. Mrs. Harris wasn't sure what was happening, but she had a feeling the story didn't match the reality. So she took out her phone and started recording. The video captured the entire confrontation. It showed Malik standing still as Mr. Johnson aggressively pointed his finger at him. The lawyer's voice was loud and clear in the footage as he accused Malik of trying to snatch his phone. You could hear the disbelief in Malik's voice as he repeatedly told the lawyer he didn't do anything wrong. But what was most important, what made Mrs. Harris feel so sure that something wasn't right, was what the video showed next. As Mr. Johnson shouted, the camera clearly caught the moment when Malik didn't make any move towards the phone. He didn't lunge at the lawyer, didn't make any attempt to grab anything. He simply stood there, trying to reason with the man. The police officers had been questioning Malik, but none of them had bothered to check the story from another perspective. Mrs. Harris, feeling it was her responsibility to speak up, walked over to the officers, holding out her phone. "Excuse me," she said. "I recorded the whole thing. This might help." The officers hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure of what to do. But then one of them took the phone from her and started watching the video. As the footage played, the officer's eyes widened. It was clear to anyone watching that Mr. Johnson had been lying. The lawyer was shown getting more and more agitated, accusing Malik of things that weren't happening. The video didn't show Malik being aggressive at all. It showed him standing still, trying to explain himself. The officers glanced at each other, their expressions changing as the truth began to sink in. The officers stopped watching the video, their faces a mix of confusion and disbelief. They looked at Mr. Johnson, who was still standing by his car, his arms crossed, trying to look confident. The officer who had been questioning Malik turned to him. "Why didn't you tell us this before?" the officer asked Malik, his tone now softer, more understanding. Malik, still in shock, just shook his head. "I didn't know anyone was recording. I didn't even know I needed proof." The officer turned back to Mr. Johnson, clearly more suspicious now. "You told us this young man was aggressive and tried to take your phone, but from what I'm seeing, that's not true. It looks like you're the one who made false accusations." Mr. Johnson's face tightened. His earlier confidence began to falter as the officer's questions became sharper. "That's not what happened," he said quickly. "You're misunderstanding the situation. He was acting suspicious. He was following me." But the officers weren't convinced. They watched the video again. Mr. Johnson's story didn't match the reality on the screen. It was clear that Malik had done nothing wrong. "You're under investigation for making a false report," the officer finally said, his voice firm. "You've wasted police resources with your lie." Malik couldn't believe it. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was mixed with anger. Why had he had to go through all of this? Why was he the one who had been questioned, treated like a criminal? He knew why, but hearing the officers finally admit the truth felt like a small victory. As the officer turned to Malik, he gave him a brief, apologetic nod. "We're sorry for what you've been put through." Malik didn't respond. He just wanted to go home. The video quickly spread across social media. Mrs. Harris had uploaded it, and it didn't take long for people to start sharing it. The footage showed the lawyer, Mr. Johnson, falsely accusing Malik of theft, and the truth was clear for everyone to see. People were outraged. The comments poured in condemning Mr. Johnson for his actions. Some called for an immediate investigation into his behavior, while others demanded that he face consequences for wasting police time and making false accusations. The video went viral, and soon, news outlets picked up the story. People couldn't believe that a lawyer, someone who was supposed to uphold the law, would act this way. The backlash was swift. Mr. Johnson's law firm began receiving negative reviews. His colleagues were forced to address the issue publicly. The firm issued a statement saying they were reviewing the situation, but it was clear that the damage had already been done. Mr. Johnson's professional reputation was in ruins. People began to question how someone in a position of power could so easily make false accusations based on racial bias. The more people watched the video, the more they saw how unjustly Malik had been treated. The lawyer's actions sparked a larger conversation about racism in the legal system and the way people of color are often treated unfairly. The law firm's clients started distancing themselves from Mr. Johnson. Some even dropped their cases in protest. The pressure was mounting on him from all sides. It wasn't just his career that was at risk, his personal life started to unravel as well. Eventually, the Bar Association got involved. They launched an investigation into Mr. Johnson's behavior, and the possibility of disciplinary action hung over his head. His actions had consequences, and those consequences were just beginning to unfold. After the incident, Malik tried to get back to his normal routine. But everything felt different. The walk home from school, which used to be so ordinary, now felt heavier. His mind would often wander back to that moment when he was accused, when the police hadn't believed him, when Mr. Johnson's harsh words filled the air. The fear, the anger, the frustration, it all stayed with him. At school, Malik found it hard to concentrate. His friends noticed that he seemed distant, quieter than usual. They didn't know exactly what had happened, but they could tell something was off. Malik hadn't really talked about the incident much, not at first. He didn't know how to explain it. How do you put into words the feeling of being judged just by the color of your skin? But as the days passed, Malik began to share his story. His mom and dad had been supportive, of course. They'd been furious about what happened to him, but they had always reminded him to keep his head high. Still, Malik couldn't shake the feeling of being targeted, of being treated like he was guilty without any reason at all. The more Malik thought about it, the more it started to eat at him. He realized how many others were probably going through the same thing, how many others didn't get a chance to prove their innocence. The video that had cleared his name was a rare thing. Most people didn't have someone like Mrs. Harris recording what happened and showing the truth. So, Malik decided to speak out. He started telling his story at school, to anyone who would listen. He wanted people to understand what he had gone through, but more than that, he wanted to make sure it didn't happen again to someone else. He joined groups that raised awareness about racial profiling. He wasn't just the victim anymore. He was becoming the voice for others who hadn't been heard. Even though he still felt hurt by what happened, Malik felt a sense of strength rising in him. He had been wronged, but he wasn't going to let it break him. He knew he had to keep going, to make sure the truth was always heard. Malik's experience stayed with him long after the incident. He couldn't stop thinking about the way the police had treated him, the way Mr. Johnson had looked at him with suspicion. It wasn't just one mistake, it was a reflection of a much bigger problem. A system that often overlooked the voices of people like him. The video had saved him. But what about the others? What about the people who didn't have a video, or a kind stranger like Mrs. Harris to step forward? Malik couldn't help but wonder how many innocent people had been wrongly accused because of their race, without anyone to stand up for them. His story had sparked conversations, and that gave him hope. People were listening, people were questioning the system, and that was the first step. But Malik knew there was still so much work to be done. The incident had opened his eyes to the injustice that so many people faced every day, and he was determined to be a part of the change. He thought about the future, about how things might be different for the next generation. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he believed it was possible. His experience had taught him something important. The truth can be powerful, but so can a voice that refuses to stay silent. Malik wasn't going to let his story be forgotten. He knew that by speaking out, he could help create a world where no one would ever have to feel like he did that day. He was going to keep pushing, keep fighting for justice, no matter how hard it seemed.